During Sunday lunch, Mom boasted, "Your sister's building her own company. When will you grow up?" I just smiled. I already did, but I don't celebrate with people who never believed I would. Her coffee cup froze in midair. I always knew Sunday dinners were a performance, not a gathering, a stiff, overcooked roast wrapped in decades of unresolved tension, pride baked into the potatoes, and shame tucked under the napkins next to the steak knives. For years, I played my part in silence, smiling when appropriate, nodding through the stories about Brenda's latest conquest, the business deals, the keynote speeches, the investors who just can't wait to throw money at her. I sipped my wine like it could keep the bile down, always counting the seconds until I could excuse myself without raising suspicion or drama. But today was different. Today, I wasn't just enduring the show. I was ending it. The dining room hadn't changed since I was in high school. Same wallpaper, same antique chandelier that buzzed if the air conditioner kicked on. Same coffee mug in front of my mom, navy blue, chipped on the handle, said "World's #1 Mom" in faded white letters. I've seen that same coffee mug on her table for 22 years, since I was maybe, 7? No, wait. I'm 37, so that makes it, 30 years. Right? Brenda was already talking before I'd even sat down fully, launching into some animated story about a developer she just hired for her newest startup. Something about AI and logistics. I stopped listening after seed round. Dad smiled like a man whose life depended on the illusion of peace. He handed me a plate stacked with meat, potatoes, a few sad-looking green beans. "Here, sweetheart," he said softly, like I hadn't been in this exact seat every Sunday for 2 decades. Like I hadn't heard her say that through clenched teeth each time Mom began one of her speeches. Then it came, the moment that always came, without fail, somewhere between the helping and dessert. My mother leaned back in her chair like a queen who'd just surveyed a conquered land, then turned toward me with a smirk that could curdle cream. "You know," she said, raising her mug like a gavel, "your sister's building something real. She's creating jobs, shaking hands with people that matter. She's out there growing up. Meanwhile, you're still playing make-believe in that little office of yours." She chuckled as if she'd just made a harmless joke, the kind that families laugh at over pie. "When are you gonna grow up and stop pretending to be? What is it you call yourself again? A therapist?" I looked at her. Really looked at her. Not like a son who wanted to prove himself, not like a child anymore. I saw a woman too small to understand who I'd become. A woman who mistook volume for power and ridicule for guidance. I set my fork down quietly, folded my hands in my lap, and smiled. Not the brittle, forced smile I'd perfected since I was 12, but something else entirely. Something older, sharper. "I already did," I said calmly, like I was discussing the weather. "I just don't celebrate it with people who never believed I would." Her mug froze midair. The room fell silent. Brenda stopped chewing. My father glanced between us like a deer sensing an oncoming car but too scared to move. I saw the flicker in Frances's eyes, not confusion, not anger, but something more fragile. Recognition, like a woman watching a building collapse and finally realizing she never laid a foundation. "I beg your pardon," she said, voice tight. I stood up. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just deliberately. The way you leave a funeral once the dirt's been thrown. "No need to beg," I said, grabbing my jacket. "Just keep drinking that coffee and pretending you didn't help break everything good in this family." "Sit down," she snapped, voice cracking like old wood. But I didn't. I walked past the roast, the plates, past Brenda's dumbfounded expression, and my father's wide, frozen eyes. My shoes echoed down the hallway like a countdown. I stopped at the front door, hand on the knob, and turned around just once. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm just done pretending this is normal." And then I left for the first time without finishing my meal, without clearing my plate like a good son should. I didn't slam the door. I didn't have to. The silence behind me was louder than anything I could have said. What they didn't know, what she didn't know, is that I've been planning this exit for months, not just from that table, but from all of it. The expectations, the condescension, the fake praise and the whispered dismissals. I've been building something, too, something quieter, something stronger. But unlike Brenda's glossy pitch decks and LinkedIn updates, mine doesn't need applause. It just needs time. And Frances? She has no idea what's coming. It's funny how you can grow up in the same house as someone, eat the same dinners, sleep under the same roof, and yet feel like you've been raised in a completely different universe, one ruled by unspoken rules that only ever seem to apply to you, where every achievement came with an asterisk and every mistake turned into a moral failing. My sister Brenda could have set the backyard on fire and Mom would have handed her the garden hose with a chuckle, calling it curiosity, while I could have sneezed too loudly in church and gotten a full 30-minute lecture about discipline and respect. She was the golden girl from day one, big blue eyes, perfect teeth, a confidence that bloomed early and never wilted. Even her lies sounded like leadership. I remember the time I realized I was the other child, not just in passing moments, but as a living, breathing identity. I must have been about 11, maybe 12. I'd won the regional science fair with a project on photosynthesis that I'd worked on for 3 months straight, skipping sleepovers and cartoons, practically living in the garage with that stupid lamp set up and rows of bean plants. When they called my name at the county auditorium and handed me that little plastic trophy, I felt something shift inside me. Like, maybe, just maybe, I was finally going to matter at home, even just a little. We came back late that evening, and I still remember walking through the front door, clutching that trophy like it was solid gold, expecting hell, hoping for something, anything. A smile. A pat on the back. Hey, look at you. Instead, Mom barely looked up from the magazine. She said, "That's cute," then turned the page. No joke. That's all she said. That's cute. Like, I just glued some macaroni on construction paper. The next day, Brenda came home with a C- in algebra, and Francis took her out for ice cream to cheer her up, said grades weren't everything, and she was proud of her for trying. It was always like that. Always. Brenda could fart in a boardroom, and they'd call it innovation. I learned early on to hide my wins because celebrating them just made the silence worse. It didn't change in high school. If anything, the gap between us grew wider, the contrast sharper. I got into Columbia on a partial scholarship for psychology. I came home with a letter clutched in my hand, barely able to breathe from excitement and fear. Frances read it over dinner, chewed her roast beef, and said, "Wasting time. You'll come crawling back after a year once you figure out feelings don't pay bills." That line stayed with me longer than any diploma ever could. If you're not making money, you're not making sense. That's the kind of gospel she lived by. I think she saw the world in numbers and dollar signs, binary success or failure, no shades of gray, no value in anything that couldn't be sold or measured. I could have been a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and she still would have asked how much I made last quarter. Brenda, on the other hand, got to fail out of 2 colleges, drift through a year figuring things out, then announce one Christmas that she was starting something big. Francis toasted her with wine like she'd just launched a rocket into orbit. And to be fair, Brenda had that charm. She could walk into a room and make people believe they were lucky just to be breathing the same air. It wasn't her fault, really, she was just raised like a princess. It's hard to blame royalty for forgetting the castle doesn't clean itself. I tried to stay invisible after college, moved out quietly, rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, worked 3 jobs at once just to cover tuition and food. Francis never visited. Never asked. Brenda stopped by once, dropped off a houseplant, and said, "It's temporary, right?" I smiled and said, "Sure." Even though I knew I wasn't just building a career, I was building a life that didn't require their applause. That plant died a month later. Too much shade, not enough light. But sometimes, life throws you a breadcrumb, a crack in the armor, a glimpse behind the curtain. And it came in the most unexpected way, through something Brenda left behind. Last Christmas, I let her crash in my guest room for a couple nights while her condo got fumigated or renovated or something equally flashy. She dropped a folder while packing up, and it slid halfway under my bed. Normally, I wouldn't snoop, but something about the handwriting caught my mom's handwriting. Messy. Angry. Familiar. Inside was a note, handwritten, folded in half, and shoved between 2 sheets of legal paper. No date. Just a line. Scrawled in all caps. "You tell anyone about that, and you're out for good." No signature, but I didn't need one. The tone, the threat, the ego dripping off the page, it was my mother's voice, clear as day. Something had happened. Something Brenda wasn't supposed to talk about. And Mom had threatened to cut her off if she did. But what? What could Golden Girl possibly know that would make Francis that angry, that scared? I put the note back exactly where I found it, said nothing, but my mind started working in overdrive. For the first time in a long time, I realized something strange. Brenda might not just be the favorite. She might be the liability. And that? That gave me something I'd never had before in that house. Leverage. There's a different kind of quiet in my office, the kind that doesn't feel like emptiness, but intention. The stillness of things that matter, of words that are waiting to be spoken, of stories that need space to breathe. The shelves stretch floor to ceiling, filled with textbooks I actually read and journals scribbled with years of notes and breakthroughs and tears, mine and others. This isn't some polished Pinterest therapist den with soft jazz and lavender candles. It's lived in, slightly cluttered, with real fingerprints on the table and photos of men who fought like hell to become something more than what was done to them. Some days I think this space is more church than clinic. There's Noah on the shelf, framed photo from 2 years ago, arms wrapped around his son, both smiling like they finally remembered how. It took time, therapy, planning, a goddamn underground railroad of support, and still the court made him fight tooth and nail just to prove he had a right to live in peace. That kind of exhaustion doesn't leave bruises, but it cuts deep in places only men seem to understand. He came to me 5 years ago, hollowed out and twitchy, flinching at the sound of his own breath, wearing sunglasses indoors even though we both knew the bruises weren't from the sun. He sat right there on that brown leather couch and whispered things no one had ever believed. She had money, charm, a smile you could sell to a bank, and fists that came down like thunder when the cameras were off. Her name was Paula Winters, and I didn't know then that I'd seen her name before on the employee roster at my mother's factory, tucked into some business Christmas card sent out to clients, even mentioned once in passing during a barbecue where Mom called her reliable as hell. That woman nearly killed him. Not once. Repeatedly. And Frances, my mother, Kept her on the payroll for years like nothing ever happened. At first I thought it was coincidence. Maybe mom didn't know. Maybe Paula kept it hidden, showed up every day with her lunch pail and her lies, kept her fists to herself inside factory walls, and only turned cruel at home. But then Noah brought me the receipts, literal ones. Emails, voicemails, reports, warnings from other employees that had gone nowhere. He'd gone to HR once. Guess who signed off on the dismissal of the complaint? Frances McMillan, factory floor manager and resident goddamn matriarch. Not only did she know she protected the bitch, told Noah to deal with his personal drama on his own time, and reminded Paula she was valuable to the team. That was the moment something shifted inside me, not rage, not quite. Something colder, something surgical. I didn't scream or throw things. I opened a notebook, turned to a clean page and started writing, not about pain, about patterns, dates, names, connections. I wasn't just helping Noah escape, I was building a case, stacking facts like bricks until a structure formed, one strong enough to stand up in court or fall like a hammer if it came to that. Noah stayed. We met twice a week. Sometimes he cried. Sometimes he just sat in silence and let the clock tick. But he stayed. That matters more than people realize. One session turned into 10. 10 turned into a plan. A year later, he filed for full custody. He won. And then he disappeared legally, safely, new name, new job, new town. He called me from a number I didn't recognize and said 2 words, "We're free." I hadn't cried in months, but I cried that day. I didn't think I'd hear from him again. Not really. I figured he'd build his life and I'd stay here, doing the work, fighting the same fight over and over again. But Noah surprised me, he always did. He came back. Not in person, but with a message, a voice note sent late one night that I played 5 times before believing it was real. He said he'd been watching everything from afar, keeping tabs, still reading the newspaper in the city where it all started. And he'd seen my name on a list of local therapists honored by the community. Small thing, but it meant something. He said he wanted to do something bold. Loud. Final. I want to go public, he said. Not for revenge. For liberation. For every man who sat where I sat and thought no one would believe them. I played the message again. Then again, I sat in this chair, under the lamp with the busted shade, staring at his picture. That smile, not fake anymore. Real. Hard-earned. And I knew what I had to do. The wheels started turning. I started thinking in headlines, camera angles, city council meetings, newspaper op-eds, and press releases. I started imagining the sound of my mother's voice when she read Noah's story on the front page, when the name of the woman she protected was dragged into daylight, when the fortress she'd built on pride and ignorance began to crack. This wasn't about therapy anymore. This was about legacy and whose story would be told. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped being a son trying to earn her approval. And I started being a man with teeth, with records, with witnesses. And Noah? He wasn't just a survivor. He was the spark. And I was the fuse. Brenda showed up 2 days after I got Noah's message, unannounced but not unwelcome, which in itself was already a surprise considering we hadn't spoken beyond birthday texts and holiday gritted teeth exchanges in years. She looked older than I remembered, or maybe just heavier, not physically, but the way people carry too many expectations that were never really theirs to begin with, like wearing a jacket 3 sizes too big and pretending it fits. I could tell something was wrong before she even said hello just from the way she paused at the door, hands in her pockets, scanning my little front porch like it was unfamiliar territory even though we'd grown up 2 blocks away from here. I let her in without making her explain why she came, and she collapsed onto the living room couch like someone who hadn't sat down for real in weeks. Her usual confident posture was gone, replaced by a slump I didn't recognize, shoulders forward, eyes dull, fingers rubbing together like she was nervous or trying to feel something. It hit me then. Not like a revelation, but a slow, dawning truth I hadn't wanted to admit. Brenda wasn't the enemy. At least not entirely. She'd been raised in the same burning house I had. She'd just been told she was the chosen one while I was given the fire extinguisher and told to stop whining about the heat. She looked around the room, at the books, the mismatched furniture, the lack of luxury that Frances would have scoffed at, and then she said, "You know, I never even wanted to run a company. I wanted to be a chef." And just like that, a wall cracked, maybe not a full collapse, but something shifted. I stared at her, this woman who had always seemed so certain, so groomed for success, and saw the girl underneath, the kid who used to steal saltines from the kitchen and build little sandwiches with butter and ketchup, who once burned toast so badly the smoke alarm went off for 20 minutes. I remembered that girl. I even loved her once. She talked for a while, longer than I expected, about the expectations, the late-night anxiety, the way Frances called every week with new suggestions that were really commands, the investors who were more like babysitters, the partners who didn't really trust her, and the suffocating weight of pretending to be a leader when all she really wanted was to open a food truck and make people smile. I listened without interrupting, nodding sometimes, but mostly just watching the exhaustion pour out of her like water from a cracked pipe. And for a brief moment, I felt it, that urge to forgive, to reconnect, to believe that maybe we weren't so different after all. Maybe she hadn't meant to parrot Frances's condescension all those years. Maybe she was just trying to survive in a system that only had room for one golden child and no space for anyone with a different dream. I thought, maybe I don't need revenge. Maybe I just need peace. Then she said it, the thing that burned the bridge before I could even reach for it. She was staring at one of the photos on my wall, a black and white portrait of one of my clients, an older man with steel gray hair and eyes like broken glass who'd left his wife after 32 years of silent torment. And Brenda said, casual as hell. Yeah. Mom said you were using those broken men to feel superior, like therapy by ego or whatever. It landed like a slap, but colder, slower, not because I hadn't heard worse, but because it meant everything we'd just shared, the honesty, the soft confessions, the vulnerability, still couldn't unteach the poison our mother poured into her ear. Brenda hadn't come to make peace. She'd come because she was drowning, and she thought maybe I could throw her a life vest without asking for anything in return. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, not trusting myself to speak without biting. I could feel the heat behind my eyes, not from sadness, but that particular kind of fury men feel when they realize their generosity is being twisted into weakness by someone who's been told their entire life that they're the protagonist of every story. I poured a glass of water, then set it down hard enough to make her flinch. Therapy by ego, I repeated. Is that what she told you? That I built my life helping people to feel better about myself? Brenda shifted uncomfortable. I mean, she said it in passing. I don't know. No. You know, I interrupted sharp now. You knew what that would sound like, and you said it anyway. She didn't respond. Just stared at the floor like it might give her an answer. I didn't tell her about Noah. Not yet. I didn't tell her about the article or the interview or the names I'd already submitted to the reporter who'd been circling stories like this for years, waiting for someone credible to finally break the seal. I didn't tell her I'd already picked the headline. The Factory of Silence. It was perfect, clean, powerful, loaded, and accurate. I didn't need her apology anymore. I didn't need her to understand me or respect me or even love me. I'd spent too long waiting for scraps of recognition from a family that only knew how to praise noise, not substance. Now I was building something bigger than approval. I was building truth. I was building fire. And if Frances thought I was going to stay quiet while she kept burying the bones under her empire of denial, then she was about to learn something real, something permanent, something that couldn't be undone with a mug of coffee and a condescending grin. She raised me to believe silence was survival, but I'd learned something better. Silence, when chosen, can be a weapon, but when broken, it becomes a reckoning. It was almost poetic how everything came full circle, how we all found ourselves once again seated around the same aging table, flanked by the same mismatched chairs that had heard more silence than laughter over the last 3 decades. Sunday dinner had always been less about nourishment and more about theater, a strange, slow-played ritual where everyone knew their lines, even when they hated the script. This time, though, I wasn't sitting in my usual place out of habit. I chose that seat deliberately directly across from Frances with the sunlight hitting her face just enough to make her squint when she tried to meet my eyes. The roast was on the table again, slightly overcooked, slightly dry, seasoned with passive aggression and undercurrent tension. David had brought out his usual green bean casserole, the one with the fried onions on top that nobody actually liked, but everyone took a spoonful of anyway to avoid questions. Brenda was there, too, seated beside Frances, silent in a way that wasn't discomfort, but defeat. Her mouth was tight, and her eyes were somewhere far away, probably back in the dream she never got to follow, probably in some quiet kitchen she'd never own. I noticed she didn't say much when we greeted each other. Just a nod and a weary look, like she was still digesting everything from our last conversation. I didn't rush into it. That was important. Timing is everything when you're about to demolish a foundation someone else built their whole identity on. So I waited. I let Frances go through the motions, chewing, commenting on the stock market, making a few lukewarm jabs at people these days and how nobody wants to work anymore. She even tossed a compliment toward Brenda, praising a new investor she'd brought on board like it was a military conquest. And then, just like clockwork, she turned to me. So, she said, her voice thick with that smug kind of curiosity that's not curiosity at all but bait, still doing the therapy stuff? I figured you'd be on to something more substantial by now. I smiled at her, not out of joy but precision. A calculated smile, one that said I see you and I'm not afraid anymore. I leaned back in my chair and tapped the rim of my water glass with one finger. Then, calmly, I said, you know, I've actually been working on something bigger than you'd expect, and it's been going really well. She raised an eyebrow, amused in that condescending way only a woman like Frances could master. Is that so? I nodded, reached into my bag, and pulled out my phone. There's a story I want you to see. Just went live this morning. It's already picking up traction. People are sharing it. I think you'll find it familiar. David looked confused. Brenda shifted in her chair. Frances just chuckled. That low, dismissive laugh she always used when she thought I was about to embarrass myself. What kind of story? I hit play. The screen lit up. A local news anchor appeared, polished and confident, introducing a segment titled The Factory of Silence. The footage cut between blurred images of a manufacturing floor, an unnamed man's voice recounting years of ignored complaints, whispered warnings, and a workplace culture that turned a blind eye to abuse in the name of production. No names were mentioned. No specific company identified. But the layout of the factory, even blurred, was unmistakable. And the voice, though digitally altered, was undeniably Noah's calm, clear, resolute. Frances's smirk faded about 30 seconds in. By the 1-minute mark, her hand had frozen mid-reach for her coffee mug. The same mug I'd watched her sip from since I was a teenager. By minute 2, the color had started draining from her face. "Turn that off," she said suddenly, sharp and loud, the authority in her voice cracking at the edges. But I didn't move. I just let it play. I wanted her to hear every word. When the segment ended, I looked at her, really looked the way you study the last flickers of a dying fire. There was no rage in me, no triumph even, just clarity. And that's when I said it, calm and clear, "You always wanted me to build something real. So I did. I built an escape hatch for men you ignored. I built a life you'll never understand." She couldn't speak. Not for lack of trying, but because there was nothing left to say. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Brenda stayed seated, face unreadable, though her eyes flicked to me with something that might have been respect or guilt or both. David looked like he wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came out. He stood up slowly, as if moving through water, and followed me out of the room when I finally pushed my chair back and stood. I didn't storm out. I walked. Deliberate. Unbothered. Free. On the porch, David caught up, opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't ask questions. Didn't apologize. Just stood there beside me, looking out at the yard he'd trimmed for 40 years while pretending not to see the roots rotting beneath the surface. "Are you okay?" he finally asked. "No," I said honestly. "But I will be." And then I left. I don't know if Frances felt shame in that moment or just defeat. I don't know if Brenda will ever understand what it means to break a cycle instead of inherit one. I don't know if David will ever choose truth over quiet. But I do know this, I didn't burn the bridge. I just built a better one. The days that followed weren't victory laps or champagne celebrations. They were quiet, methodical, like the aftermath of surgery where you're not sure if the operation was successful until the healing begins. I went back to work the next morning, sat in my office chair, and stared at Noah's photo on the shelf. The news segment had aired, but the real work was just beginning. My phone started ringing before noon. First, it was Dr. Martinez from the Community Health Center, asking if I had time to consult on a case involving workplace harassment. Then Sarah Chen from the Legal Aid Society, wondering if I'd be willing to serve as an expert witness in a domestic violence trial. By Thursday, I had 3 interview requests from regional news outlets and a voice message from a documentary filmmaker who'd been following stories about institutional cover-ups in small manufacturing towns. But the call that mattered most came on Friday evening, just as I was locking up the office. Unknown number, hesitant voice. "Is this? Are you the therapist from the news story?" The man on the other end sounded young, maybe mid-20s, with that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying secrets too heavy for your shoulders. His name was Marcus, and he'd been working at Frances's factory for 8 months. He'd seen things, heard things, witnessed the same patterns that had protected Paula Winters and silenced Noah years earlier. "There's more," he said quietly. "More people like your client. More complaints that got buried. I kept copies of everything because I don't know, I guess I knew somebody would need them someday." We talked for an hour. Marcus had documentation spanning 3 years, emails, incident reports, witness statements, even audio recordings of supervisory meetings where complaints were dismissed or ignored. He wasn't the only one. Apparently, the news segment had reached other current and former employees, people who'd been waiting for someone credible to finally speak up. "I want to help," Marcus said. "But I can't lose this job. I've got a kid, and the insurance." I understood. That's the trap these places count on, people too financially vulnerable to risk speaking truth to power. But Marcus had given me something invaluable, proof that Noah's story wasn't isolated, that the culture of silence Frances had cultivated was systematic, deliberate, and ongoing. That weekend, I drove to the coffee shop where Noah and I used to meet during the worst of his legal battle. It was one of those places that tried too hard to be rustic, exposed brick, Edison bulbs, chalkboard menus with unnecessarily complicated drink names. But it had good Wi-Fi and terrible acoustics, which made it perfect for sensitive conversations. Noah was already there when I arrived, sitting in the back corner booth we'd claimed as our own during those long months of preparation. He looked different. Better. There was color in his face again, and when he smiled, it didn't look like it hurt. We ordered coffee, he got something with oat milk and cinnamon, I stuck with black, and for a few minutes, we just sat there like old friends catching up instead of therapist and former client planning to dismantle a system of institutional abuse. "You know what's funny?" Noah said, stirring his drink slowly. "I used to think healing meant forgetting. Like, if I could just stop thinking about what happened, stop feeling angry, then I'd be okay." He took a sip, made a face at the temperature. "But watching that news segment, seeing other people step forward, I realized healing isn't about forgetting. It's about making sure the story serves something bigger than just the pain." We spent the next 2 hours going through Marcus's documentation, cross-referencing dates and incidents, building a timeline that painted a clear picture of institutional negligence. Noah had brought his own files, everything we'd compiled during his case, plus new information he'd gathered from other former employees who'd reached out after seeing the news coverage. The pattern was undeniable. Francis's factory had a documented history of protecting abusers, silencing victims, and prioritizing production over basic human safety. But more than that, it was connected to a network of similar facilities across the region, all sharing the same corporate culture, the same HR practices, the same casual indifference to violence when it happened in employees' homes. This isn't just about one factory, Noah said, spreading documents across the small table. It's about how these places work together to keep people quiet. Look at this. He pointed to a series of emails between Francis and managers at other facilities. They were sharing information about problematic employees, people who'd filed complaints or sought help for domestic violence. Creating informal blacklists to prevent these workers from finding jobs elsewhere. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. It was one thing to ignore abuse within your own workplace. It was another to actively prevent victims from escaping by sabotaging their employment prospects. This wasn't just negligence, it was conspiracy. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of wine and my laptop, drafting an email to investigative reporter Janet Walsh, whose work on corporate accountability had won 3 regional journalism awards in the past 5 years. I'd been following her coverage of labor issues for months, and I knew she'd understand the significance of what Noah and Marcus had uncovered. The email took me an hour to write. I explained the situation carefully, attaching selected documents that wouldn't compromise anyone's safety but would demonstrate the scope of the problem. I offered myself as a source, along with Noah, Marcus, and the growing network of current and former employees who were finally ready to speak. I hit send at 11:47 p.m. and immediately felt like I'd just jumped off a cliff without checking if there was water below. Walsh called me the next morning before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. She had a voice like gravel and cigarettes, the kind of journalist who'd probably seen every variety of human corruption and still managed to sound surprised by how low people could sink. "I've been waiting for someone to crack this open," she said without preamble. "I've had my eye on these facilities for 2 years, but I needed someone on the inside, someone with credibility." We talked for 90 minutes. She already had sources at the State Labor Department, contacts in the Attorney General's office, and a photographer who specialized in industrial exposés. "This is going to be big," she warned me. "Bigger than just your mother's factory. Are you prepared for that? Because once this story breaks, there's no putting it back in the bottle." I thought about Noah's smile in the coffee shop, about Marcus's quiet courage, about all the people still trapped in jobs where speaking up meant losing everything. I thought about the son I used to be, desperate for approval, and the man I'd become, building something that mattered more than family harmony. "I'm ready," I said. And for the first time in my life, I truly was. The investigation took 6 weeks. Walsh worked with a team of 3 other reporters, combing through documents, interviewing sources, and connecting dots across a network of facilities that stretched through 4 counties. They found evidence of systematic cover-ups, financial incentives for managers who kept complaint numbers low, and a corporate culture that treated domestic violence as a personal problem that employees needed to handle without involving their employers. The story broke on a Tuesday morning in October, front page of the regional newspaper with a headline that made my chest tight with something between pride and terror: "Factory network silenced abuse victims for years, investigation finds." Francis's facility was named specifically, along with detailed documentation of the cases they'd buried, including Noah's. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. First call was from Marcus, voice shaking with either fear or relief, maybe both. "Jesus Christ," he said. "They actually printed everything. Your mom's name is right there in black and white." The second call was from Francis herself. I let it go to voicemail. Then I played it back 3 times, listening to her voice crack as she demanded I call her back immediately, that we needed to talk, that I had no idea what I'd done. She was right about that last part, but not in the way she meant. And maybe, someday, they'll cross it, or maybe not.